In a recent CNBC article, Dr. Anthony Fauci stated that U.S. coronavirus cases are surging because the nation totally didn't shut down. And when I listen to this statement, it makes no logical sense, especially if you understand constitutional law. Now, your Dr. Anthony Fauci is proposing something that just isn't possible due to our United States Constitution, which gives states rights over their municipalities. And because all 50 states have rights over their own municipalities, it is just not possible for the entire nation to totally shut down at the same time. Because if your President Trump were to go out here and insist on such an order, what would happen would be all of these governors would go out here and want to file a case in federal court talking about how their rights are being violated as related to the 10th Amendment and suits against states, and they would also be talking about how they have rights as states as related to states' rights. So when I look at Dr. Anthony Fauci's statement, it comes from a place of ignorance as related to the laws of this land, because when it comes down to the laws of our United States Constitution, they grant states complete control over their municipalities, and it is governors who have the ultimate and final choice of how trade and commerce are done within the borders of that state. Now, the president has control over the interstate commerce as related to the highways and the highway systems, and he has control over interstate commerce and trade overall. He can dictate how rights are done on the national level for certain things as related to the power of the executive branch, but it is the states that have the power as related to their rights, and they control the executive branch of their municipalities. But when I look at Dr. Fauci's statement, I see him making the same play that Ray Nagin made many years in 2005 with Hurricane Katrina. Now, your Ray Nagin wanted to make George Bush out to be the bad guy, and because he wanted to make George Bush out to be the bad guy, he wanted to blame George Bush for the state and conditions that went on in New Orleans and the state of Louisiana as related to Hurricane Katrina. But it was Ray Nagin who was the mayor of New Orleans at the time, and it was up to him to take responsibility for preparing the city for Hurricane Katrina, and he did not take that time to prepare the people in New Orleans, and it led to the bedlam that transpired in the aftermath of the hurricane. And what he wanted to do was say that that bedlam was the result of your President George W. Bush, but it wasn't in George W. Bush's responsibility. He didn't control the municipality. No, that was controlled by the mayor first, who was the first executive who controls the city, and it was controlled by the governor who controlled the state. So they wanted to bypass those people, just like Dr. Fauci is trying to bypass all of these governors and these mayors who are in charge, and then tell us, oh, the cases are surging because the nation totally didn't shut down. Well, again, this is just not possible as related to our United States Constitution, and it's not possible because each individual state has its own jurisdictions, and it has legal jurisdictions over what can be done inside of a state. And when I look at this statement by your Dr. Anthony Fauci, it comes from a place of extreme disingenuousness, because to say that these cases are surging because the nation totally didn't shut down it just doesn't make any logical sense, because the whole goal that he came up with and proposed, flattening the curve, this was something that just wasn't going to be feasible if you understood basic human behavior and you understood basic societies overall. Yes, you might be able to flatten the curve short term by going out here and shutting down all of these so-called non-essential businesses, but the long-term damage of such an action would eventually lead to these cases surging once more. And the reason why those cases would wind up surging once more is because once you allegedly flattened this curve and made it where the hospitals could be able to take on all of those patients, what's going to happen is that nation is going to open back up, and all of those people who were at home eventually are going to go back outside. And once those people start going back outside, you're going to have the exact same situation happen once more. So that's why the whole flattening the curve theory just fell apart. And that's something most people aren't thinking about because so many people are caught up in their emotions about Donald Trump that they're not thinking critically about this approach and why this approach failed. And the reason why this approach failed is because you cannot flatten a curve. Yes, you might short term be able to stop the hospitals from being overwhelmed by patients, but in the long term, you're not going to be able to do that because once you reopen the economy, whether it be something done early or late, eventually the whole situation is going to spiral out of control, and those hospitals are eventually going to wind up overwhelmed. But even worse than that, those hospitals would not have access to the economic resources because if your economy is depressed because you shut down many of these non-essential businesses, then you don't have any tax revenue to pay for any of these municipal services, especially for poorer patients who are on Medicaid or Medicare or who have no health insurance overall. And if businesses are out of business, that means many people don't have the money to be able to pay for health care, which exacerbates a situation with an already overtaxed healthcare system. Because if people aren't, if the whole thing with the United States is if we're not generating revenue to be able to pay for services, eventually you're not going to have the money to pay for hospitals. And this is why your President Trump was forced to reopen the economy, because he knew that the economic damage would be far more devastating than the whole COVID-19 disease. And it would be that cure being worse than disease that would do more devastating damage to the U.S. economy. Because if you don't have anybody making money, then the states don't generate tax revenue. And if the states aren't generating tax revenue, then you don't have money for municipal services and you don't have money for hospitals to treat COVID-19. And what happens is the disease winds up spreading even further because you don't have access to economic resources to pay for the PPEs or the ventilators or even the electric bill to pay for the ventilators. And because many are so caught up in their emotions about Trump and so caught up in their fear over COVID-19, they're not thinking critically about the bigger picture as related to this disease and the impact of this disease. The reason why these cases are surging primarily is because the theory of flattening the curve has failed, and this theory is an absolutely ridiculous one when you think about it critically. Theoretically, this is an idea that would possibly work only in the short term, and again, because you have this disease still in the air, what's going to happen is long term, you're going to have people going out, and as they go out, the germs are going to return to the air, and it's going to just start all over again. And this is something that Dr. Fauci really didn't think about as related to COVID-19. He thought, oh, we'll shut the country's not so-called non-essential businesses down, but people are still going out and about. And what's happening is that when you have these reports talking about how one state has a surge, guess what? The people then go to the states that don't have the surge, and what happens is that migration spreads more disease. And when you have states like California going out here and talking about sheltering in place, what happens is when people find out they cannot go and get their businesses and services in one state, they then drive to another state. And again, this further puts people at risk for COVID-19. And again, this is going to keep happening like a vicious circle, because what happens is many of these doctors, they don't understand that in the United States, our laws are about states having separate rights, and with each state having its own separate set of rights, you're not going to be able to shut a nation down like a New Zealand, because New Zealand is a socialist country, and two, it's a single country. That it's a monolithic people. So you're not going to be able to do what happens in New Zealand and other countries in the United States, where you have 50 different municipalities, 50 different policies, and again, the whole ultimate foundation is the theory you have is fundamentally flawed, because you cannot flatten the curve as related to a disease. I mean, that was already disproven by what happened with these reopenings in certain areas, that your attempts to flatten the curve, you might say, oh, it's too early, but eventually all of the states are going to be the same, because you cannot flatten a curve as related to preventing hospitals from being overwhelmed, because everybody's basic social behaviors are going to lead to the spread of this disease. And again, it's just a vicious circle. And many of these people with this COVID agendas, they don't see how things are a vicious cycle. And because they don't see how things are a vicious cycle, they are just doing the exact same things and not seeing how doing the exact same things are just like expecting a different result. And that's the textbook definition of insanity. And it seems like those who are in charge of the government, they are completely insane when it comes down to COVID-19 and trying to combat COVID-19, because the theories they have they just don't make any logical sense, because they are trying to fight a disease, and you cannot fight a disease with policies that are inconsistent, and even inconsistent when you look at the statements of guys like Dr. Fauci or people like the people who run the Centers for Disease Control. All of them always make inconsistent statements, and because they're not consistent in their approach, this is why there's so many problems. They want to complain about the nation not totally shutting down, but the problem is that they don't have any consistent information about this disease, so that people can make a consistent strategy to combat it. And as I see it, a lot of these approaches, they're just destined to fail, because again, you cannot fight a disease like this and try to do it by trying to flatten the curve and hide from it. The whole thing is that your attempts to try to hide only lead to the disease spreading, because people migrate from one area to another, and when they migrate from one area to another, it just leads to more COVID-19 spreading in those areas. Because what happened early on was people left New York and went to Florida, and now we have a surge in Florida, and we also have surges in other states, because people go from one state to the other looking to get their products and their services. And this is a vicious cycle, and it's a vicious cycle because nobody really has a strategy on how to deal with this crisis. And there's no strategy because the people in charge really just don't know what they're doing.